Chart and Stats Essentials, brief details of our key measures. Our charts have evolved over the last 3 months to the point where a new viewer might find them confusing. Here's an essential summary of what they show. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. While many services, Infographics, Statistica, Worldometer, Bing, etc., show basic charts and do occasional articles to make a point, they tend to be limited and, dare I say it, biased to the agenda. Oh, look how terrible Sweden is doing without a lockdown. That sort of thing. The agenda has never made sense, as was obvious from the very beginning. One glance at the death rates, 0.2% below age 40, and this was not an existential threat to society. The problem was 3 false memes were pushed to make it seem as if it was an unholy trinity of falsehood. The 3 are exponential, lockdown, and flattening the curve. No virus is exponential in growth. Even the lazy use of the term by epidemiologists and on Wiki refers to, as honestly noted on some sites, the first generations and is not strictly exponential but growing rapidly for a short term. Lockdown should have an effect, obviously. It turns out in the UK it didn't, not against reported figures anyway. And then those reported figures diverged away from anything resembling a virus contagion. Flattening the curve had a plausible appeal, easing the strain on health services under the massive attack of the virus, except the massive attack of the virus was itself a mythical creation of fraudulent models. We have dedicated multiple videos solely to the topic of the modern version of SIR models, which turn out to be nothing more than advertising machines for fictitious threats. They are based on an exponential virus which doesn't exist and massively exaggerate real-world situations and have failed time after time. Sadly, the power of these memes has been so immense they rival or overshadow that other great meme, that of God. The issue isn't whether God exists. The issue is what people can do once they decide that God is responsible for everything, including their lives. I nearly walked in front of that bus, but God saved me. Fair enough. Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. But the guy snatching you back from the curb definitely saved you, regardless of what motivated him. UK massively hit by the virus. Without lockdown it would have been far worse. Far worse than second worst ranked in the world, 125 times worse than the Far East, with dodgy charts and deaths data. So our job with the charts is to look at reality. We cannot see the virus directly. We have to observe the reported virus effects, most notably the cases and deaths data, and it turns out that they're pretty revealing. A government can report a disaster, a massive attack on society, but it faces 2 problems. If the rest of the world isn't sharing that experience, then what gives? A bit dodgy, perhaps? Even attempting to report exaggerated data is fraught with problems. Things start to look wrong. Our charts contain enough data of a critical nature that you can pretty much convict a country on their basis alone. Certainly they're enough to make a case for investigation. Sadly, the people who'd be doing the investigating are owned by the governments providing the dodgy data, so all we can do is provide the information and let you decide what to do with it. Given that they're rather complex and people have asked about their source, meaning and interpretation, I've created this video to cover the essentials. It won't teach you the concepts, e.g. exponential and debunking that false meme, or curling over, our term, and why it was so important in the beginning and still now. I may do another video for that, but frankly it's been a 3-month expansion and 60 plus videos to get to this point, so perhaps it would be appropriate for new viewers to review some of those. Bear in mind that each video comes with a PDF, so you don't have to sit and watch. Download the PDFs and scan for concepts and explanations that got us to this point. As such, let's move on to the charts and data. We'll tell you what is there, how it's calculated, and hint at its relevance, but like any topic, true understanding will take further effort. One thing I would emphasize is that the maths is simple. It's percentages and arithmetic. Why it's irrelevant is indeed the more important issue. but the what will hopefully get you started. Our core source is the World Health Organization reported figures updated daily in theory by world governments. Originally they were copied by us and typed in by hand. Fortunately, we can now download 200 plus countries in a single file from covid19.who.int. Since we normalize to 100 million population, we need population figures, and generally we'll take a Bing or Google search, but we also used World Bank data. Whether the UK is 66 million or 67 million is not going to materially affect the analysis. It's a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. Normalizing to 100 million population means that if the UK with a population of 66 million, for example, reports 1,000 deaths, then we scale that up as 1,000 times 100 over 66 equals 1,500, close enough. Obviously, Excel does the arithmetic accurately. For the purpose of explanation, I'm not going to be overly concerned about decimal places and accuracy for an educational, I hope, exercise. As a sole individual who's typed in thousands of data points, generated hundreds of spreadsheets purely to monitor this situation, it is possible that errors creep in. I've said from the very beginning, don't trust me, fact check, do the math, it's not hard, and very occasionally a viewer does indeed catch something. I'm all for that. It's the principles that are core. Nevertheless, such errors are rare and are rapidly fixed. We also use a standard mortality rate of 9 per 1,000, which seems about right for a Western nation, or many of the world's nations. Yes, it does imply that we live to 110 years of age, when we actually have a life expectancy of 80 plus years. Bizarre, but that's the kind of figures that are reported, so we use them. 9 per 1,000 means 900,000 per year for our standard 100 million population, or 2,464 per day. As such, COVID would have to kill 2,464 people a day in each nation or a nation to be considered a threat equal to ordinary life. Needless to say, even the worst exaggerators struggle to get close to that. The rest not even close, not in the slightest. But that's only thanks to lockdown. You see what I mean? God would have struck us down with the virus, but in His mercy, His servants, our politicians, implemented lockdown. So we're only facing a reported disaster, not a massive crisis, and that's why we've taken full control of your lives to protect you. Or they lied, and people believed them. I can't make people give up their unholy faith. I can only show you what governments are reporting and compare and contrast with ordinary mortality, death in ordinary life, death rates due to COVID that are absurd, virus trajectories that are absurd, and literally half the world experiencing virus contagions that look rather more normal and at a fraction of our deaths, and by fraction I mean tiny. 1% of the power centres, UK, US, New York, EU, Belgium. So let's get to it. We work primarily with cases and deaths which are reported daily and as totals. We refer to them as C for cases, D for deaths, N for new aka daily, since we've already got a D, and T for total. It's a simple shorthand, but CT or C.T therefore refers to cases total. Likewise C.N daily cases, and D.N daily deaths, and D.T deaths total. If you see NP, that's normalized population. We rarely cite the base figures working to a uniform NP basis, but on each chart you'll see the actual country's reported figures and you'll see the population noted so you can check the scaling. The NP figure is the base figure times 100 over the population in millions. A viewer did just that and noted an anomaly. It turned out I hadn't updated the range between updates where we pull the latest figure. Good catch, the math is simple, but sure, absolutely, fact check it so you reinforce your understanding and you may be saving me embarrassment if I've slipped up. A couple of other concepts. We've already highlighted the distinction between death rates due to COVID equals deaths over cases, and mortality, how many people die per year from other causes. Other people have done excellent work on excess mortality. Our charts don't use that precisely. We work with concepts such as implied death rates, death days, overall mortality, and percent of daily mortality. The implied death rate is due to an observation. You're not supposed to die the day you go into hospital. Thus, deaths today should in theory be for cases from perhaps a week or 2 weeks earlier. We can't track each death to each case, not having that data, but we can do a simple test. If people typically survive a week, what would the death rate be for deaths today divided by cases a week ago? If they survive 2 weeks, what would be the death rate for deaths today divided by cases 2 weeks ago? We refer to those as DR7 and DR14 respectively. The death rate lagged 7 days and death rate lagged 14 days. This is a great dodgy dossier detector. Search Wiki if you're not familiar with the dodgy dossier. Older people should be. If the government stuffs deaths, falsely assigns deaths to COVID, without being patient and also exaggerating cases, then not only will the simple, today's death rate, look bad, 14% or higher, but the lagged will tend to shoot up, even to 100%, or for Spain, 322%. Yes, it's true, according to the UK government reported figures, at one point they managed to have every COVID case die, whereas in Spain, 3 times as many were reported to die as even had the disease. A neat trick. Might want to investigate those countries and their figures. Let us also emphasize that these are indicators, like a low fuel warning in a car or an undercarriage warning if you're a pilot. The gauge may be inaccurate, but you'd be foolish to ignore it. It's a cause to investigate, so do that. For mortality, comparing COVID with ordinary life, we look at the 2464 deaths, 9 per thousand, that our 100 million standard population will be deemed to experience anyway each day. If a country has 2464 COVID deaths in 3 months, say, that's 1 day's normal deaths in 3 months. Not really a crisis, huh? But that's thanks to lockdown, which is why we'll be looking very carefully at lockdown and its bizarre lack of effect. But deaths days, whatever, that's how many normal days deaths the total COVID deaths represent. The worst hit reported nation in the world is Belgium, EU headquarters, with the UK following, though the US, New York, exceeds even Belgium by 5 times. Couldn't have the US not be worst hit or leading the world. As a nation, the US is down around the number 10 slot, as we'll see shortly. At 34 death days for Belgium, that's 1 month's deaths. The UK is at about 22 days. We gave up democracy for a bad 3 weeks' deaths. Why did our parents, grandparents and great-grandparents bother fighting and dying in 2 world wars? Our nations have sleepwalked their freedom away. Here's an example report that isn't a chart per se, but is also derived from the same data. It basically ranks countries and guessed US states and cities by normalized deaths. This is the full listing for that report. It lists all countries with over 1 million population and more than 1,000 cases, with the extra US guest states and cities. We'll show it full screen. From the full listing, we can determine the average hit for SEA, Southeast Asia, and FE, Far East, which is Southeast Asia plus Western Pacific. They had about 500 deaths per 100 million people in total. So with Excel doing the arithmetic properly, we can report a bad SEA and a bad FE figure for each nation, being how badly it reported being hit versus Southeast Asia and the Far East. The same virus? What's truly remarkable and sad is that the so-called media managed to report on just about anything supporting the alarmist agenda, but somehow completely failed to notice that the West is getting hit 100 times worse than the East. Go figure. Divide the reported deaths in those tables by 2464 and you get death days, how many ordinary days deaths COVID represents. 2 other measures are daily mortality, the percentage of, and overall mortality, the percentage of. It's all just arithmetic, and they're just indicators, but very revealing. Overall mortality is this. If a country has had 100 days of COVID since its first death, whether it's first death or 10th death or 100th, I'll have to look, but you get the idea. Countries didn't start simultaneously, and we want to be fair. That's 246,400 deaths is experienced just as life. 100 times 2464, ordinary mortality. So if that country had experienced 4928 deaths, which I hope is 2464 times 2, that would be 2 death days, and it would be 4928 over 246400 overall mortality equals 2% of overall mortality, i.e. it's barely figured as part of life's deaths experienced by that nation. Would you seriously give up your freedom for as little as 2% of ordinary mortality? Some nations have, especially in the Far East, Australia and New Zealand. Check the charts for the actual figures, but they're low, very low. So this is akin to excess mortality, a measure of the degree to which COVID has been a material factor in the experience of a nation's deaths. Even the highest ranking, exaggerating agenda nations, the UK and Belgium, struggle to get to up to 20% or 30% overall mortality. So ordinary life was still more dangerous despite all their efforts, and we don't shut down for that. But that's due to lockdown. 400,000 UK lives saved due to lockdown. Yup, the dogma is so deep it'll take invasive surgery to get it out. Genius, brilliant memes, utterly programming entire peoples to cease to think. The other mortality indicator we use is the daily mortality percent of. If a country reports normalized deaths of 1232 versus a standard mortality of 2464, that's 50% of a day's deaths were due to COVID. It's an indicator. We're not concerned about set theory, overlap, exclusive or. We have the reported figures and we're generating simple indicators from them. You'll see that for most nations the daily mortality percent barely figures, and then you hit the agenda nations and wow, a monument to black. Speaking of colours, generally we use blue for cases, red for deaths, black for mortality, gold for growth rate decline, and orange for Hubei, but they're not set in stone. And speaking of Hubei, Hubei is one of 34 provinces in China. It is home to Wuhan, and while China implemented a highly successful strategy ignored everywhere else, blockade, not lockdown, it didn't save Hubei, which got hit 50 to 100 times worse than even the next worst provinces, and it took 84% of cases, 96% of deaths by the time the contagion was over and reporting ceased, March 15th. There was a lot of talk of China lied. They probably do, but pot and kettle. The West lie machines have been running non-stop. People thought China understated their figures. If they had, other nations, e.g. Italy, would have raced past Hubei in cases and deaths. Instead, it took a long while in those heady early days before Italy reached Hubei and then passed it, and then was passed in its turn by Spain. And the Far East doesn't even get close to Hubei, while most countries get somewhere close. So no, China didn't lie. They gave us an excellent reference contagion, rapidly followed by South Korea, whose record as a how-to-do-it-right nation is exemplary. So Hubei is like our Mach number. Hubei had 3085 deaths for 59 million people, or roughly 5,000 deaths per 100 million. So 1 times Hubei in deaths means a country had 5,000 deaths per 100 million. 2 times Hubei is 10,000 deaths, approximately. And whereas 850 miles an hour may not mean much, Mach 1.2 tells you it's faster than the speed of sound. And no, I've no idea what the accurate figures would be for that, and you'd have to factor in air density, etc., so forget it. So Hubei acts like our Mach meter. Do better than Hubei, Far East is 0.1 Hubei typically, and you're doing well. Do worse than Hubei, and we'll wonder why. One nice thing about our Hubei meter is that it works for cases. Death days we can compare with ordinary mortality. But how do we get standard ordinary sickness? Maybe we could, but we don't. However, 1 times Hubei in cases, 2 times Hubei in cases, that's straightforward, and so we use that. A final note on cases and deaths. Early on we focused on cases and ignored deaths. Deaths were too easily stuffed. Then they went wild with testing, a massive red herring, and messed up cases. So now we include deaths, recognizing that both are distorted, Nice going, government. That's it. Those are most of the key concepts beyond the true giants, curl over, lockdown, flattening the curve, for which we've dedicated entire series of videos. We certainly can't do them justice here, and for the purpose of introducing our charts, we'll stick to, and here's a chart with cases and deaths. To truly understand them, I'm afraid, as in all things, it's going to take a little effort and review of our earlier work. This is a grad level debunking of governments using their own data. At some point we have to allow that people are going to choose to make the effort to understand, or they won't. There's plenty of videos to choose from, and there are associated PDFs if you want to make that effort. So here's our standard chart as of June 2020, and we're going to go through each item briefly so you can have some familiarity as to what is shown and what to look for. We've chosen Germany as it's a pretty normal chart, showing what a trustworthy nation's chart should look like. It's still reporting a lot more deaths than the Far East, but it's doing so in an orderly fashion. It comprises a main panel, an instrument panel, yes, my misspent youth as a pilot, with supplementary gauges, and stats. We'll go through all of them in due course. Here's the main panel, and these are its key features. A log scale on the left, Hubei cases in orange. Cases total, we use dark for a 5-day average, light for actual, and we show the country cases total. Below that we have the country deaths total. Below that we have a line for the 2464, the standard day deaths. Below that you can see the country daily cases, and below that in the red the country daily deaths. And to the left in orange the Hubei deaths, the dotted line. Notice the country name is included bottom right. From earlier, the line names should make a bit more sense now. NP equals normalized population, CAS and death, obviously cases and deaths. Day and cum are aka new and total, daily and cumulative. np.mort.n is 2464, the normalized population mortality daily, and that's to compare daily deaths to. As soon as the cases started bending over, nothing to do with lockdown, the natural form of a viral curve, which we called curling over, the crisis was over. Deaths would continue, but exponential it was not. Climbing straight lines on log scales are exponential. The moment you see curl over bending, you know it's not exponential and the crisis is over. Deaths will continue, but it is not an existential threat. And tiny hint, when we put the image full screen for a few seconds, the idea is that you can pause the video and study it or take a screenshot if you wish. However, there is always a PDF version available, link in the video description. The instrument panel. These are key visual indicators. We'll cover them one by one. The first one is one of a pair, one for cases and one for deaths. These are perhaps the most important indicators on the whole chart. They are exponential and lockdown debunkers and fraud detectors. To understand how and why, you need to recognize that even as they pushed the exponential meme, the official images were never exponential. Time after time, even though you've been told about the massive risk of the exponential virus, the official images have been of a normal humped curve. Even Ferguson's official 510,000 deaths chart was a normal, not exponential curve. Strictly speaking, it was log normal, literally. A $40 million Excel chart. And as it turns out, there's only one tiny little thing which differentiates an exponential curve line on log scales and a normal curve. The growth rate for new cases doesn't change. That's it. If cases double today, they double tomorrow. If they double over the first 5 days, they double over the next 5 days. Here's an exponential curve with R0, if you like. I use F0, it's my curve, of 1.8. That's today's cases is 1.8 times yesterday's cases. Realistic? Not the point. We're doing math and illustrating something. That G figure, FG, growth of factor, is critical. Here it's 1. That says that the daily growth in the virus, today's cases over yesterday's, never changes. It is the defining feature of an exponential curve. And in 3 months we've basically got every subatomic particle in the universe with COVID-19. The official models get around this by using an SIR or SEIR compartmental model. The SIR and SEIR models don't advertise that they're exponential, but they are, rising exponentially, straight line on log scales, till shortly before peak when they whip over and decline exponentially. Here's the SEIR prediction for Sweden, and the reality. The reality is that blue line squashed on the bottom. Roadkill. Not exaggerating much then, Mr. Ferguson. And the only thing I need to change, and it's a tiny change, is that G number, FG, from 1 as here, giving exponential, to 0.985 as here, and bingo. We're down from more atoms than there are in the universe, or whatever, a very big number, to a very manageable 120,000. And that's a teensy-weensy change from 100% to 98.5%. However, given the power of the exponential, Gary Hannington, mouthpiece of the agenda, are you listening? The chart is incredibly sensitive to that G or FG number. Let's show you 0.98, 0.985 and 0.99. They look the same, but look at the peak case figures. 0.005 changes take it from 7,000 to 120,000 to 40 million. Wow. We should be very careful with that number. And of course, add a last teensy-weensy 0.01 and make it 1 and power exponential, and the whole universe gets the virus. So no, it was never exponential, not even in their models, which were almost perfectly exponential until magically the virus about turned and declined, also exponentially. Exponential doesn't turn, full stop. It was never truly exponential, and even their false exponential was utterly false and misrepresented the virus and any contagion, which looks normal or humped, and what that means is growth declines from day 1, and they never got around to telling you that. So when they said lockdown is working, growth is declining, no, they lied. Because in true contagions, real contagions, growth is declining from day 1. It's a characteristic feature of humped or normal curves. And when they said, look, the curve is flattening, no, they lied. The sigmoid curve, that is characteristic of humped or logistic normal whatever curves, is flattening because that's what the totals chart of a humped curve does anyway. Check it out on Wikipedia, the logistic curve. Even a freaking Egyptian virus, you can figure that out, has a classic sigmoid totals curve, S-shaped cumulative curve. So if the mummy returns, you know what to look for in the daily charts. Because that declining growth rate means that the curve will be humped or normal, not exponential. It's a critical distinction, and you won't find it mentioned anywhere. Go figure. It is like Western power centers being hit hundreds of times more aggressively by the virus, and no one notices. The media's capacity to ignore information that debunks the agenda is astonishing. So the moment you see the growth rate f declining g less than 1, you know you're dealing with a humped or normal curve. Which is the same as saying that the moment you saw the chart curling over, you knew it wasn't exponential, which is why these charts were so critical in the early days. In fact, things were so simple, we could do half a dozen charts at once, complete with projections, and look, there's Sweden doing better than anybody. Massively curled over already. Until the world noticed that no lockdown Sweden was doing rather well, and that story changed. That's not conspiracy theory, that's simply what the charts are telling us, but we're not here to teach that today. It is, however, why this indicator and its deaths companion are so critical. That dotted gold line is the growth rate, F in our previous examples. The solid gold line is the auto-fitted growth decline line, FG or G as in previous. It is not auto-fitted to the dotted line. It's way better than that. Hubei and Korea, which both were completed before Ferguson published and we went into lockdown, are perfect examples. Indeed, Korea's curve is a work of art. It fits the log normal so perfectly. Everywhere you look, you see normal or hunt curves in infographics and in actual posted data for cases and deaths. It's the normal virus doing its normal thing. There's a reason it's called normal. And starting with Hubei, we tried something, and it turned out to be magical. Sure, if it's humped, we could jiggle means and standard deviations to get one that looked okay. But what if there was a sound reason for our choices? One that said it has to be this mean, it has to be this standard deviation. Now, does it fit? This is an eye-opening and jaw-dropping revelation for me, because there are 4 things that have to match and we can only control 3 of them. So like squeezing my wife into a size 6 dress, she's 6 foot, and long tall Sally just closed to the virus, another victim of this fraudulent charade. You can choose the style, the cut, even the waist or hips or whatever it is, but if it ain't cut for 6 foot, it ain't gonna fit my beloved. And trust me, I love that she's 6 foot, I'm 6'4", and yes, it is weird when I rarely do meet a taller woman. But that dress still isn't going to fit. It's the wrong model. So if we can control 3 or 4 elements and the 4th fits, that's a freaking awesome confirmation that we're dealing with a real and valid rationale. And by now, viewers have seen literally hundreds of these auto-fit normals, and it's amazing how well they fit, even for pre-peak countries. So much so that when one doesn't, it's a really good indicator that we should pay attention and see what's happening. But first, what's this auto-fit normal? Just briefly. You can check out normal distributions on Wiki, which I heartily recommend, but you'll still need to see this to understand how we let the virus, or reported figures, choose the 3 critical variables. And if the 4th fits, well honey, you look amazing. And she does. The variables are the mean, which is a date, the peak cases, the height of the peak, the area under the curve, the total cases, and the spread or the slope is the 4th variable. So for a humped normal curve, we obviously have a peak, which occurs at the mean, and also the median. No worries, simple. It's got to peak in the right place. That's 1. It's got to have the right number of peak cases. That's 2. And it's got to have the right number of total cases. That's 3. Now we can arrange those simply enough, find the peak case day and make that our mean. The area under a normal curve, it's a probability distribution, is 1. So apply a scaling factor for the total population, i.e. 2 times cases up to peak, as it's supposed to be symmetrical. That only leaves us one more variable, the standard deviation, which controls both spread and height, given that our scaling factor is already fixed to 2 times cases to peak, aka total cases. A wider curve, lower peak, and vice versa. Here's how we do that last fit in practice. The blue is the base data, which was a false normal in that I generated it using the F and G numbers only, rather than using the Excel normal distribution function. And now I'm going to match it for illustration. We've detected the peak, easy enough, find which row has the max value and count how many days down that is. We've detected the total population to assign, 2 times cases to peak, since it's nominally symmetrical, and that's our scaling factor. Now we simply start with a generic standard deviation of 10, which seems to work reasonably well for the kind of timescales and charts we're doing, and it's going to be wrong, and that's fine. It produces the grey line here, not quite a match for the blue. Measure the peak cases on our N1 first try and compare or get a ratio between that and the base that we're trying to match to. So 10 gets us 100k, we need 120k, and the ratio is therefore 100 over 120 or 5 over 6. So we multiply the first attempt standard deviation times 5 over 6 and voila, the orange is a fit. I had no idea that such a simple correction would work so well, but it does. and I'll let smarter mathematicians than me, there's a lot of them, almost all of them, tell me why it works, but who cares? Without even code, just a formula, we have an autofit based on the virus's own data. So yes, this is a pretty freaking amazing little indicator packed into one tiny box. The dark blue is the real reported data, the pale blue the autofit normal per the above, and the solid gold is the theoretical, i.e. autofit growth decline line from that curve, and the dotted gold is the actual German growth rate. It's pretty obvious that the real data is a pretty good fit to both the normal curve with a lingering tail and to the growth decline line going solidly under 1 at 1 new cases equals old cases, i.e. peak or over. For the daily cases decline, that growth number has to go below 1, and that's really significant. The virus doesn't detect peak. The virus doesn't report its progress. The virus doesn't anticipate peak. It doesn't have an agenda. It's just a simple biomachine. Politicians do track the virus, they do report its progress, and they're well aware of peak and its emotional significance, and they do have agendas. So what happens when the virus no longer acts like a virus and at suspiciously key moments? Is that a conscious virus, or is that a conscious choice by the politicians? Let's give you a couple more to look at. How about this one on the right? What happens at peak? It doesn't go down like the one on the left. Look at the dotted gold. It stops at 1 for a long while. Now, is the virus some hive mind alien entity tracking its progress and just knowing when to put in an extra effort to keep those cases coming? Or does someone else track the virus, report its figures, see its approaching peak and decide, nah, we'll have some more? Or this one. Wow, ain't that a doozy? So there's this virus, see, everything normalish till peak, the actual case growth declining perfectly in line with the autofit, and whoa, hey boys, peak? No way. Let's hang out here a while, way too early to go down, and sideways it goes. Of course, it's not just cases which have got diluted with testing, way to go to contaminate a crime scene. Here's deaths, sharp rise, very sharp, but actual growth decline, gold dotted, a perfect fit to the auto-fit normal, bright red, until peak, and when it's, whoa, no, there will be no decline, not yet. Notice the actual cases does decline, but someone spotted it was approaching peak and decided that the growth rate didn't need to decline just yet and needn't decline too fast, so they got a lot more deaths recorded, a much fatter curve than it should have been had it been normal. Now the apologists are thinking yes but here's my yes but to your yes but. Does the virus know it's approaching peak? That's the giveaway, because politicians and statisticians can sure as hell see that approaching 1. And yeah, check this out. Pity the poor suckers in this place. Sharp rise to peak, perfectly matched by the autofit, bright red, we're doing deaths here. Dotted gold, actual growth decline, mirroring the solid gold autofit decline perfectly, until wham, the virus detects peak and goes sideways. I mean, seriously, does it have CNN? I didn't even know viruses got wireless. How do they track their overall progress? Yet here it is, auto-detecting it's at peak and putting in a special effort not to reduce as it should, but to keep those deaths going. And no, it's not inevitable. Here's Germany's deaths, which has a strong decline in line with normal before getting a slightly fat tail at the minuscule deaths per day at that point as a factor in daily mortality. We can live with that. This, though, is fraud, criminal fraud, pure and simple. Want to know who those other nations are? Sure you do. Now you know what to look for. Our chart updates will make a little more sense, won't they? On to mortality, the comparison of the COVID crisis deaths with our ordinary deaths for a normal or nominal 100 million population at 2464 deaths a day. So we scale up or down the country's figures and see how many deaths it's been getting a day and how many it's accumulated overall. The percent of a normal day's deaths is in black, daily. The overall is the dotted orange. So you can see here that for Germany, even at peak, COVID deaths never represented more than maybe 17% of a day's normal deaths, and overall it's down at what, 3% maybe. Would you give up democracy for the sake of 3% of normal deaths as a temporary phenomenon? But it's only because of lockdown. Without lockdown it would have been far worse. I'm sorry, weren't you listening? Yeah, that was the UK, declining perfectly in line with the normal distribution until peak, and then it went sideways, increasing cases and deaths. Before that, before April the 12th, when the growth rate should have plummeted due to lockdown, nothing, no change, just the same old, normal. It was always normal until peak, when the virus detected it was at peak and suddenly stopped declining. A guy invents a massive figure based on a fraudulent model and sells you a crisis, when it was always just this, normal, until peak, and then politicians padded and padded. If there was justice, this would be a criminal case against Johnson and Ferguson and many others. But when the government perpetrates the crime, who do you empower to investigate? The police? The media? Their loyalty and failure is a matter of record. We're still in lockdown. Politicians do track the virus, they do report the virus, and they do have an agenda. And if you think we're bad in the UK, wait till you see Sweden. Go check the chart updates. It's all here, but nobody's looking, except now at least you know. Argue all you like, but a virus doesn't track its progress. It doesn't have a hive mind. It has no awareness of peak. It has no agenda. Politicians do track the virus, they do report the virus, and they do have an agenda. In some ways, this is one of our favourites because it leads to some of the most absurd results, which are therefore the most condemnatory of the fraudsters. You see, it's difficult to commit fraud in COVID without being detected. If you stuff deaths, exaggerate deaths, without adding cases, your death rate goes up. If you add deaths without waiting for cases to build, your death rate goes up, which is what we're looking at here. If you refuse to allow peak, you no longer look normal, as we've seen. In fact, shades of 9/11, it's not that there's no evidence of government fraud, it's that nobody's noticing. And if you dare speak up, you're a conspiracy theorist. And these days that can get you blocked on YouTube or Facebook. It really is a sad time. However, to put the previous indicator into context, it may help to look at this last one. This is cases to deaths lag. You're not supposed to die the day you go into hospital, so you'd expect most deaths to occur sometime after most cases, as seen here. This is a visual indicator of that separation. We can also ask which is the peak cases day and which is the peak deaths day, simple max function to auto-detect the peaks, and look at the separation. We can then quote that, as we'll see in the stats. For Germany, it's around 14 days. Now 14 days sounds about right. I've seen figures for hospital stays of 3 weeks, but getting hospital stays before death stats hasn't proven too easy, and in any case, as ever, we're getting what we need right here from the core data. Germany says 14 days with orderly charts. Works for me. Indeed, consider that we've got extremely sophisticated charts showing a great deal of intriguing data, giving insights into countries, and yet the raw data is no more than cases and deaths. So much value from such basic material, and yet no one else seems to be doing this. Bizarre. And most of our work is solo country, i.e. with one country as focus. We do the summaries, but no in-depth comparisons between countries, mainly for technical reasons. In Excel, it's straightforward to have complex data on many single countries, or simple data on many groups of countries, but not both. These sophisticated charts highlight the bad practices and dodgy data of the worst culprits, but it's the simple summary showing the power centers being hit hundreds of times worse by the same virus that to me is the simplest and most damning statistic of it all. We're in a Western charade and it sucks. So how about these two? That country on the left is racking up the deaths on the same day as the cases, peaks matching. while here on the right we've got a bizarre flat top peak with the deaths peak pretty much dead center, no lag. What the miscreant nations forgot, or maybe they just don't care and it seems they're right not to, nobody's noticing, is that if you death stuff in line with cases and don't allow for lag, then when you acknowledge that you're not supposed to die the day you get into hospital and match deaths today to cases a week ago or 2 weeks ago, on the way up a week or 2 weeks ago there were a lot fewer cases, so death rates go high. That middle country has a death rate touching 100%. The right-hand country 300%. Yes, 3 times as many people died as even had the disease. Wow. Remember, these are indicators, but those are pretty basic and reasonable measures to evaluate. You really are not supposed to die the day you get into hospital. And to get death rates like that, it's a strong hint of fraud. And if this wasn't the government committing the fraud, that would be time to call in the police. So here's the visual indicator for the basic simple death rate, today's deaths over today's cases in green, and 2 lagged cases, 7 days in blue and 14 days in red. As you'd expect in the early days when cases and deaths are climbing, go back a week and the death rate goes up, fewer cases. Go back 2 weeks and it goes up a lot. But notice that here, in responsible Germany's case, with properly lagged deaths to cases, 14 days as we've shown inset, lagging the deaths back to cases doesn't phase the figures. They just go from extremely low, in the early days there were cases but nobody was dying, 2 weeks later they would begin to die, to reasonable, spiking at what looks to be about 14% or the max death rate for normal cases. Bear in mind that China provided us with excellent data on death rates by age, which have been borne out by every nation. Bottom line, below 40 the risk of dying is minuscule, rising pretty much exponentially till it's around 15% at your mid-80s. And the orange line is the total death rate, i.e. latest total deaths divided by latest total cases, here looking to be around 5% to 7%. Tricky to read off log scales, which these are, 1, 10, 100, the giveaway, but we'll see an exact figure in the stats. So Germany, responsible Germany, with its 14-day gap between cases peak and deaths peak, isn't phased and simply ends up with an in-normal range, 15% or so, whatever that is, and yes, we'll be able to read it off in stats later. So Germany is clean as far as this indicator goes. Not these two. They were so keen to rack up deaths that they either forgot or didn't care about the effect it would have on their true death rates. Both of them hitting 100%, the one on the right actually 300% off the scale, more people dying than had the disease. So that's our last pair of visual indicators. Look for that cases death separation and see how high that red line goes. Anything much above 10% and you've got a dodgy country. Notice this is an indicator that catches cheating in the early phase because, like it or not, just because cases are rising fast doesn't mean that every single one of them should be dying. If the stats are off, it's a warning to not trust the reporting government. Now, you recall the mortality indicator? Want to see what those two bad boys were doing in the mortality stakes? We've got evidence of death stuffing by the high implied death rates. Does that show up elsewhere? Naturally, it does. While Germany is struggling to get above about 17% daily mortality, i.e. COVID deaths are 17% of standard daily deaths, our two miscreants are up at 60% and 80%. And while Germany has an overall mortality, COVID deaths as a factor of total normal deaths over that period since first COVID death, of what may be 3 or 4%, our two other countries are up at 20%, 6 times worse. You think anyone noticed? Of course not. Even at 20% though, for 3 months it's not even close to reaching actual normal risk of life levels, and it's for 3 months, a single season. But it would have been worse if not for lockdown. No, but seriously, that false meme is genius. Even at these levels, in fact because we're at these levels, people are even more eyes shut. Bizarre. The worse the government cheats, the more the people believe them because their brains shut down under stress. It's remarkable, sad, and very scary. Now we chose Germany because it has a very tidy chart, alles in Ordnung as one might expect, but it's still an EU core nation. If you want to see what the real COVID-19 looks like and what could have been achieved if we weren't in the grip of an agenda, we have to go to the Far East. So here's three nations, their panels, and take a look at their mortality, flatlined at the bottom of the gauge, and their very normal lagged death rate, red right-hand gauge. Notice also how they have fully developed normal distributions, red and blue, first two gauges, good cases to death separation, and implied death rates under 10%. That's normal. That's the COVID-19 experience you could have had in the West if not for being in the grip of an agenda. I'll flash it up again so you can pause and check them out briefly before we move on to stats. On to the stats, which are largely just engineers' readouts, actual figures for what we've shown in the charts. There are a few figures which are more for my use in specialist research, e.g. recreating the charts as were available to Ferguson when he created his fantastical figure, which we'll note but not dwell upon. Bear in mind, all these figures are based on straightforward arithmetic. You could download the WHO data and do a couple of checks, and one viewer did catch that our first figures for normalized population weren't accurate, and they were right. In that update, I'd failed to extend the range that picked up the final cases and death figures for the country. It happens, we're human. So what do we have? Country name, population in millions, so we can normalize to 100 million, and last reported cases and deaths. Normalize those as the figure times 100 over the population in millions, and you get np.cases and np.deaths. Total death rate is np.deaths over np.cases, but it's also just deaths over cases. Hubei is our reference region. The Far East does way better at a tiny fraction of Hubei's cases and deaths, and the Western agenda nations do far worse, with US New York taking the prize for the most absurd overvirus or Cuomo virus. Versus Hubei in C cases is country's np.cases over Hubei.np.cases. Similarly for deaths. Hubei's figures aren't shown, but the World Health Organization March 15th has the last regional update, 3085 deaths, 59.17 million people. Cases offhand I don't remember. MP.death days. One death day equals 2464 deaths equals 9 by 1,000 for 100 million population, a reasonable figure for a Western nation. 9 by 1,000 is 900,000 per annum. Divide by 365.25 equals 2464 deaths per day. So if a country in 3 months or 2 months or however long has 2464 deaths, that's one deaths day. And if you get that in 3 months, that's hardly a factor. State, climbing, peak, post-peak, done, hasn't updated for a while, but most of the world is done. Very few nations are still climbing. Death rate lag 3, 6, 9, 12 and 15 were the original lag intervals, akin to 7 and 14 that we've seen, and I've left them in place. Date mode last and date to is so that I can recreate a limited chart only up to e.g. 22nd of March, the day before lockdown, the chart that was available to Ferguson, to be ignored by him, naturally. Why bother with the facts when you have an agenda? Second half, country name again, gz.d points and gz.c points again for me when recreating early charts. A chart with only 5 data points is hardly a fair candidate for a trend, but it starts getting interesting at 10, and e.g. Hubei and South Korea were already over with completed charts before Johnson announced lockdown on Ferguson's fictitious numbers. That Ferguson has the temerity to reproduce those numbers, claiming 470,000 lives saved by lockdown or some such, or that Johnson should restate the 530,000 figure in extending lockdown, is the nail in the coffin to innocence. Those are utterly fraudulent claims that are being restated and held to months after they should have been binned. And who is standing up to contest them? The gz.c.rank is just a measure of how many points are available to us, not something you need to worry about. The profile 1.1.4 and p.caption was a study to see the state of the world, and interestingly, many nations had this kind of mini-outbreak, outbreak pattern. Forget second wave, outbreaks are natural. Daily.mortality max, this is a big one. That's the max of the black line indicators in the daily mortality, i.e. what percentage of daily deaths do that day's COVID deaths represent. So even at peak, Germany wasn't more than 17%, a temporary intruder into normal life and death. Overall mortality, even more significant, perhaps the most important figure of all. Since the first COVID death, we count 2464 normal deaths per day. That's how many people have died during the COVID crisis, but just normal life deaths. And what percentage does the total COVID deaths represent of that figure? The simple emotive for me interpretation of that is you gave up democracy for 3.6% of normal deaths. It really is as simple as that. A whole nations ran scared and are still running scared, and the elite are having a field day. Death rate total last, basically a repeat of the earlier figure. Death rate per last reported totals, deaths over cases. Death rate per day figures are the daily death rates per lag, 0, 7 and 14 days. Green, unlagged, is 13% here. Pale blue, lag 7, 10%, and red, lag 14, is 14%. So Germany is clean and normal. The extra cases, blue.c, and deaths, red.d, are nominal figures using the autofit normals. I wouldn't use these in a court case, but they're indicative. It's simply what would 2 times cases to peak have been, and how many have actually been declared. Likewise for deaths. Even honest and excellent charts like Korea, Republic of, have lingering tails, and testing of course dilutes the value of cases, inflating the number with gosh you got antibodies, lucky you. Death's bloat is more significant, but even then it's flawed for court purposes, because it assumes that progress to peak was clean and natural. As such, they're interesting, but I wouldn't assign any great weight to them. By far the most significant figures are the total death rate versus Hubei and MP.deathday section, the daily and overall mortality figures, and the death rate lag 14 to catch the cheaters. That's it, a pretty thorough walkthrough of the elements of our standard chart. It's come a long way since the basic cases curves, but they were critical in debunking exponential. I'll leave a few slides in place from our last update, which I'm using as the template for this PowerPoint, saves the formatting hassle. Just the full screen versions, a few seconds each, so you can pause and review as you please. Have fun. I hope this has given you a bit more background and understanding as to what we're charting, why we're charting it, and how to interpret it. See you next update, if there is one. I guess there will be someday. There you go. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.